Greetings and salutations, everybody. It's XLJtheOG from Cole TV, and welcome back to Back in the Day. Now here on Back in the Day, we take a look back at the history of World Championship Wrestling through all the different eras of WCW, because there is so much to cover. So let's get right into this week's episode. And for our top story this week, we are going all the way back to May 17th of 1992 for the very last WCW WrestleWar pay-per-view, WrestleWar 1992. And this is known for arguably one of the greatest War Games matches in World Championship Wrestling history. Talking about the Dangerous Alliance versus Sting's Squadron. You look back in the history of World Championship Wrestling, probably one of the greatest factions of all time is the Dangerous Alliance. And it's so crazy to me because they were only around for about a year, if that. But the impact they had on WCW is one unlike any other. And we look back at the history of the Dangerous Alliance and the origin stories of how it all started. You have to go all the way back to 1991, where Paul E. Dangerously was working as a color commentator for World Championship Wrestling. Paul E., we all know and love, has said some pretty crazy stuff over the years. Anyways, said some pretty controversial things on World Championship Wrestling television, and thus was essentially fired as a color commentator. However, he still had his managerial license, and he decided that he was going to bring down World Championship Wrestling brick by brick. And in order to do this, he would enlist an A-list group of wrestling stars. And it started first with Ravishing Rick Rude, who would make his debut at the WCW Halloween Havoc 1991 as the Mysterious Phantom. However, later that night, Paul E. Dangerously would reveal his plan to the world and reveal that Ravishing Rick Rude and Medusa would be a part of his Dangerous Alliance, which would just grow over the months to come. But Paul E. right off the bat decided in order to take down WCW brick by brick, he had to go after the franchise itself, Sting. And Sting at the time was your current United States Heavyweight Champion, so Ravishing Rick Rude would go on to challenge Sting and defeat him for his U.S. Championship. While this is going on, Paul E. starts adding more and more wrestlers to the fold. Wrestlers such as Arn Anderson, Bobby Eaton, Larry Zbyszko, and a very young Steve Austin. And thus the Dangerous Alliance was born. And the Dangerous Alliance just had a great group of wrestlers. I mean, you have arguably two of the greatest tag team wrestlers of all time in Bobby Eaton and Arn Anderson. You have this young up-and-comer in stunning Steve Austin, who is just dominating as the World Television Champion. And you have the mind of the one cruncher, Larry Zbyszko. The Dangerous Alliance would just run rampant throughout the WCW roster, with Rick Rude holding on to the United States Championship by defeating Sting, as we mentioned earlier. Steve Austin, already the World Television Champion. Bobby Eaton and Arn Anderson taking down the Steiner Brothers and becoming the World Tag Team Champions. Outside of the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, the Dangerous Alliance pretty much had all the gold in WCW there for a while. Now, after Sting would win the WCW World Heavyweight Championship from Lex Luger at Super Brawl 2, his feud with the Dangerous Alliance would pick right back up. And thus, Sting knew he needed some help, so he enlisted some of his friends as some of the top babyfaces in World Championship Wrestling would come to his aid, including some of those who had been wronged by the Dangerous Alliance. Some of those wrestlers included Dustin Rhodes and Barry Windham, his tag team partner, who, keep in mind, Barry Windham was taken out by Larry Zbyszko and Arn Anderson back in October of 1991 at the Halloween Havoc pay-per-view. Also, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat was in a feud with Ravishing Rick Rude over the United States Championship for several months that saw some phenomenal matches as well as a brutal beatdown. I mean, this was one heck of a feud. Now, the wild card to Sting's Squadron would be that of Nikita Koloff, because keep in mind, Nikita Koloff and Sting had feuded the year prior. Actually even had a Russian chain match at the Great American Bash 1991. But Sting had made his choice and assembled his team, and thus the War Games match at WrestleWar 1992 was born. And as I said before, this match often gets referred to as the greatest War Games match of all time. It is a really awesome War Games. I mean, it's a bloody, just brutal battle. Sting's rivalry with the Dangerous Alliance was just tailor-made for War Games. And when you add into like the fact of all these other wrestlers who've been wronged by the Dangerous Alliance, it just made perfect sense for this matchup to take place. Violence in this matchup is pretty intense. I mean, you see a bloodbath from like Stunning Steve Austin and Dustin Rhodes. There's so many guys that bleed in this matchup, man. Now, the finish of this match would be one of the more unique finishes, I think, in War Games history. You have where Larry Zbyszko actually have removed the turnbuckle piece. Not the turnbuckle pad, but I mean the entire, like, the neck of the turnbuckle, if you will. And where he takes the bar and he's going to hit Sting, but Sting gets out of the way and he hits his partner, Bobby Eaton. And Sting gets Bobby Eaton in an arm bar, putting the pressure on the shoulder, really. And essentially, Bobby Eaton does submit, losing the matchup for the Dangerous Alliance. Now, what would be interesting about this is the aftermath, as Zbyszko was pretty much being blamed for the loss, and I mean, rightfully so, because he did make the mistake. And ultimately, this would lead to the demise of the Dangerous Alliance. But as I said before, the Dangerous Alliance is still one of the most talked about factions in all of World Championship Wrestling. I mean, the Impact, although it was a short time frame, they still left a huge impact on World Championship Wrestling. And this War Games match is a sight to see. I highly recommend you go back and watch this match if you've never seen it, because it is awesome. And that is our top story of the week here on Back in the Day. Now here on Back in the Day, we also like to highlight a match of the week, and we're going to stay in the same year, actually the same time frame as 1992, but we're just going to go back a little bit before WrestleWar 92. Matter of fact, we're going to go back to the pay-per-view before that, Super Brawl 2, with the one of the greatest light heavyweight, cruiserweight championship matchups you'll ever see. I'm talking about the matchup between Flying Brian Pillman and Jushin Thunder Liger. This rivalry was spectacular because this rivalry really is so great, so much so, not because of like, you know, he said, you know, promos, anything like it. It was just everything was in ring. Everything was just like, you know, who is the better mat technician, who is the better high flyer, who is the better wrestler overall. And man, oh man, Jushin Liger and Brian Pillman had some insane chemistry, unlike any others. Just the back and forth between these guys. And these guys feuded over the Light Heavyweight Championship for several months, with Jushin Thunder Liger actually winning it from Brian Pillman and holding on to it for several months. And this Light Heavyweight division was primarily really made for Brian Pillman. So it was interesting early on in his reign to see like somebody like a Jushin Thunder Liger be such a huge threat, a serious threat for Brian Pillman. But Liger could go, man, as we all know. I mean, this is a young Jushin Thunder Liger in his early career, and this would be Jushin Thunder Liger's first real big exposure here in North America. Would be this rivalry with Brian Pillman, and their matchup they had at Super Brawl 2 was just incredible. You talk about ahead of its time. That's exactly what this match is. When you look at all of the aerial maneuvers and just the spots that happen in this match is just second to none. I mean, you've got wrestlers from generation to generation that are copycatting this matchup still to this day. Back and forth was incredible, but ultimately, Flying Brian Pillman would win back his light heavyweight championship. But man, oh man, just the respect between these two, just phenomenal. Here on Back in the Day, we always take a look at a rivalry in WCW, and this week we're going to go fast forward here a little bit to the year 1998, and we're going to talk about what a lot of people have said is one of the best feuds of all time in WCW, and honestly, I have to agree. And we're talking about the rivalry between Chris Jericho and Dean Malenko. Now, this all started at the beginning of 1998 when Chris Jericho would win the Cruiserweight Championship from Rey Mysterio. And of course, at this time frame, the Cruiserweight division is absolutely loaded with talent. But this year, 98, was really the year of Chris Jericho, as he would just go on a tear, dominating the Cruiserweight division. And he really, this was the first time we saw Chris Jericho truly, like, develop his character. Because, I mean, at this point, Jericho, what we've seen was just like your cookie-cutter, white meat babyface. But now working as a heel, working as like a cocky jerk. His promos, finally getting to see him cut promos, which was awesome. At least cut promos where he's not like kissing babies and like, I'm going to do this for the people. Just the true GOAT that Chris Jericho is. The early foundations of Chris Jericho you really see here in 1998. And you couldn't ask for a better dance partner with Dean Malenko. How we got to that rivalry, how we got to that feud. As I said, Jericho won the Cruiserweight Championship from Rey Mysterio. And from there, his like confidence just built. He just became this like cocky, arrogant prick of a champion. Nitpick at his opponents each month that he'd be facing at the pay-per-view and just like tear them down and take stuff from them. At Super Bowl that year, he ended up beating Juventud Guerrero and took his mask. The next month, he would have a match with Dean Malenko for the Cruiserweight Championship. And we all knew and loved Dean Malenko because he got it done in the ring. Like, that's what everybody loved about Dean Malenko. And really, Dean Malenko, if you look at this point, was just everything. I mean, if you thought of the Cruiserweight division, his was kind of the face of that division. And you just thought about, like, how great of an in-ring technician he is, just how phenomenal of a wrestler he was in the ring. Didn't necessarily have to say it or do it on the mic. I mean, everything Dean Malenko did was in the ring. And we loved it. So Chris Jericho would go on to defeat Dean Malenko at WCW Uncensored, which a lot of people considered as a big upset. And after the fact, Mean Gene Okerlund would come to the ring and attempt to interview Dean Malenko and ask him what he would do next. And Dean Malenko just simply replied, home. Thus, as if this defeat to Chris Jericho was just so devastating, like, he just didn't want to wrestle anymore. And of course, Jericho, being the heel that he was at the time, had to egg it on for months and months with Dean Malenko. Matter of fact, the very next night on Nitro, he came out and proclaimed himself as the man of 1,004 holds. You know, considering Dean Malenko was the man of 1,000 holds, so he one-upped him. And what was so amazing about this promo is this is like, I think, the first real promo, like, for Jericho that people really were talking about the water cooler the next day, so to speak. So Jericho, after defeating Marty Jannetty, pretty much gets on the mic and starts reading off this list of all these moves that he's the master. And it's so funny because they go to a commercial break, and Jericho's still reading the list when they come back. It's like this. Hold 1, arm drag. Hold 2, arm bar. You get the idea. Now, you would think defeating the man and proclaiming yourself as the new man of 1,004 holds would be enough for Chris Jericho, but no. On a later edition of Nitro, Jericho would have a framed picture of Dean Malenko inside the ring, and it was like he was kind of giving like a eulogy, essentially, for Dean Malenko. Well, this is where it gets really personal, is when Chris Jericho would start talking about Dean Malenko's family. And he was mocking the late, great Boris Malenko, Dean Malenko's father. So much so that he would bring out an opponent later that night to wrestler called Boris Malenko. Now, next week on Nitro, Dean's brother Joe Malenko would show up and confront Chris Jericho about the scathing promo that he cut the week prior. Jericho would use one of his trinkets, such as the leg of Rey Mysterio, to attack Joe Malenko after he turned his back on Chris Jericho. Now, as I said before, Jericho was dominating the Cruiserweight division, so much so that they decided at WCW Slamboree that year they would have a Battle Royal, where the winner of the Battle Royal would face Chris Jericho later that night for the Cruiserweight Championship. I'll never forget, too, the Chris Jericho as the announcer introducing all the wrestlers coming out. So funny. Classic Jericho. Now, the finals of this Battle Royal would come down to Juventud Guerrero and Sequel Play, which was kind of a surprise because nobody really knew a whole lot about Sequel Play. And there's this weird moment where Juventud and Sequel Play are like staring at each other, and then they shake hands, and you think they're going to lock up, but then Juventud Guerrero like voluntarily jumps over the top rope, and thus Sequel Play is the winner of the Battle Royal. So Chris Jericho gets in the ring and starts to like cutting a promo, tearing Ciclope down, how this is a joke or whatever. But to our surprise, Ciclope would take his mask off and reveal it to be one Dean Malenko. At this point, the crowd goes ballistic for Dean Malenko. They are just so excited and are like, yes, finally, Jericho's going to get his comeuppance, if you will. And they have a match, and yes, Dean Malenko would defeat Chris Jericho and would win back his Cruiserweight Championship after all the crap that Jericho had talked and spewed out. Now, this could be like the perfect ending for the rivalry, but the rivalry would continue to go on in WCW for a couple more months. But Chris Jericho was the master of the loophole, and since Dean Malenko won the Cruiserweight Championship as Ciclope, and it wasn't really like Dean Malenko was advertised to be in the Battle Royal, Jericho went to the WCW committee, and thus they took the strap away from Dean Malenko and put the championship up as vacant. Because keep in mind, Chris Jericho was a conspiracy victim. So a match would be set for the Great American Bash that year, where Dean Malenko would meet Chris Jericho one-on-one for the vacant Cruiserweight Championship. So you knew this matchup was going to be intense, and they were brawling outside the ring. I mean, this was not your typical in-ring classic Cruiserweight Championship matchup. No, this was a physical war between these two. And Jericho, being Jericho, got inside the head of Dean Malenko and just pretty much told him that his father would be ashamed of him. Thus, Dean went crazy, just started beating the hell out of him, and ultimately would grab a chair, hit him with it, and get disqualified. But because of this, that meant Chris Jericho would win the Cruiserweight Championship back yet again. Now, going into the Bash at the Beach that year, Chris Jericho was supposed to face Dean Malenko in a rematch for the Cruiserweight Championship. However, Dean Malenko would be suspended by WCW, and thus Jericho didn't have an opponent. Well, Jericho did in fact have an opponent, and it was the returning Rey Mysterio Jr., who Jericho had injured earlier that year. And Dean Malenko just so happened to be in the building, and may or may not have helped Rey Mysterio Jr. win back the Cruiserweight Championship. But once again, Chris Jericho, he's the conspiracy victim here in all this, would go to the WCW committee, and they would give Jericho back his Cruiserweight Championship. And in the process, because of Dean Malenko's interference and constantly trying to get at Chris Jericho, WCW was forced to fire Dean Malenko as a wrestler in World Championship Wrestling. Now, Jericho, seemingly with all that behind him, would go into the Road Wild pay-per-view of 1998 to defend his championship against Juventud Guerrero, an old foe he knew very well. However, WCW, it was announced that even though he wasn't a wrestler in WCW anymore, didn't say anything about him refereeing, so Dean Malenko would work as the special guest referee for the Juventud Guerrero Chris Jericho Cruiserweight Championship match at Road Wild that year. And ultimately, Juventud Guerrero would win the Cruiserweight Championship. Now, you would think there would be the feud would continue on between Jericho and Dean Malenko, but after this, it pretty much just stopped, essentially. So no real definitive final match between the two, which I think would have been amazing. But Jericho was just getting so over as a heel, as a top heel, they just decided to essentially kind of take him out of the Cruiserweight division completely. And, of course, we all know the rest is history. But 1998, the run of Chris Jericho in WCW is amazing, and the rivalry he had with Dean Malenko is second to none. Highly encourage you to go back and look back at the history of this rivalry, because it was one for the ages. And it's our rivalry of the week here on Back in the Day. Now, if you know me or you follow me on social media on our YouTube channel, you know I am a collector. I love collecting all sorts of things in pop culture. And of course, I love collecting wrestling memorabilia. But one of those things from wrestling that I love to collect is magazines from the past. And here on Back in the Day, we always like to take a look at some of these magazines. So for this week, we're going to be looking back at the November 1992 WCW Magazine. Let's take a look.
Also on this cover, we've got the shocking truth behind the Valentine Rhodes War. Ooh, an interview with Steve Williams and Terry Gordy, the Miracle Violence Connection. 10 questions for stunning Steve Austin, and ooh, a poster of Medusa.
Come on now, let's get into the magazine and read about how I won the World Heavyweight Championship already. Damn!
Here we got some late breaking news, and here you see the return of Jake the Snake Roberts to World Championship Wrestling, where he attacked Sting. And there it is, the top story. We'll be talking about it here in a little bit. Ron Simmons won the World Heavyweight Championship from Big Van Vader.
And the working man Arn Anderson say you need to subscribe to WCW magazines.
Oh, hear me out with Brad Armstrong. And let me just say, Brad Armstrong is, in my opinion, one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. Does not get nearly enough love. Brad Armstrong is an incredible worker. If you ever get a chance, go back and watch some of his matches, because Brad Armstrong can go. Oh, look. It's the WCW crossword. Let's see what we can find. Oh, so we got to find the wrestler's name. So Stunning Steve Austin, Beautiful Bob Eaton, Terry Bam Bam Gordon. You get the idea. Oh, this is interesting. Here's an ad for Pro Wrestling Illustrated. And at this point, PWI was putting out a weekly magazine, believe it or not. Oh, 10 questions with the returning Jake the Snake. And man, oh man, if that ensemble doesn't scream the 90s, I don't know what will. Look at this. What do you think of Ron Simmons capturing the World Heavyweight title? What would you think of Jake Roberts capturing the World Heavyweight title? Oh, Jake. Just when you think you've got the answers, he changes the question. Oh, I love this too. How many pet snakes do you own? Ownership's not a term I've used with regard to other living beings. But he's apparently got a dozen. So, there you go. And here we got a poster of the month. It looks like it is the First Lady of WCW, Medusa. There you see Medusa on the inside there. And there she is. And here's the top cover story. Ron Simmons winning the World Heavyweight Championship in what was a historic moment that's still talked about to this day. There he is. The man himself. And they talked about the shocking truth. Is this why Greg Valentine wants to maim Dustin Rhodes? Which, yeah. Greg Valentine would have a rivalry with Dustin Rhodes during this time frame, and is it because of Dusty? Is that why? That's what's suggested in this article. Here you see some shots here of Greg the Hammer. And you know, Greg Valentine's run in 92 in WCW, I don't think it's nearly talked enough, man, but it should. He had a good run there, I think. Alright, we've got coverage from the Great American Bash of 1992 in this issue. Of course, the Great American Bash that year was primarily known for the NWA World Tag Team Championship Tournament, which took place all throughout the show. And here you see some of those matches. We saw about Flying Brian and Jushin Liger, that match from Super Bowl II. They'd go on to be a tag team in this tournament. How awesome is that? I love this. Look at that billboard. I'd love to be drive by and seeing that in my hometown. Now, also on this pay-per-view, it's very well known that this is the pay-per-view where Big Van Vader would win his first WCW championship by defeating Sting in what a lot of people kind of consider an upset at the time. And in the finals of the tag team tournament, Terry Bam Bam Gordy and Steve Dr. Death Williams would defeat Dustin Rhodes and Barry Windham to become the NWA Tag Team Champions. Hey, and segue into Steve Williams and Terry Gordy, here is an interview with the Miracle Violence Connection, which, once again, although their run in WCW was short, I still think they are one of the greatest tag teams of all time. Oh, here's the championship challenge. Can you guess the wrestler by looking at their torso? That number 4 is probably going to fool you guys, but I know who they are. And of course, we got to talk the official WCW stuff. Buy the merch, buy the merch! I'm telling you, I will get that Sting jacket at some point. Now look at this, they had a little blow-up air guitar for Fan Hammer. Oh my god, check out those leopard print pants of WCW. And here we got some VHSs, we got some key rings, a Michael Hayes cassette. Oh, and talking about it, coffee in the big time. Get you a WCW coffee cup. In our parting shot, you see light heavyweight champion at the time, Brad Armstrong, shaking hands with WCW Tag Team Champion Rick Steiner. Oh, and look, you can join the WCW official fan club. Get this shirt, and this hat, and so much more. And of course, you know we gotta get that plug for the hotline, WCW's Wrestling Hotline, 1-900-909-9900. Calls cost $1.49 for the first minute, 99 cents for each additional minute.
The November 1992 WCW Magazine is our magazine of the week. And finally, here on Back in the Day, we always like to take a look at some of the unique merchandise throughout the years in World Championship Wrestling. And for this week, we're going to take a look at some unique Tiger handheld games. Because, I mean, come on, every kid had this. I mean, yeah, you wanted the Game Boy, but all you could truly afford to get is the little cheap $10 Tiger handheld game. But you still played the crap out of it nonetheless. And when you were on a school bus trip, every kid wanted to play with your Tiger handheld game. And like I say, WCW had some of these. They were called Grudge Match. Now, they actually looked a little unique. As you can see, they would have like the wrestlers like kind of there as part of like the buttons or kind of like on the side of the design and things. So it made this pop out more than your stereotypical regular Tiger handheld game. Now, they had 3 different versions of these that Tiger released. There was Scott Steiner versus Rick Steiner, Hollywood Hogan versus Goldberg, and Raven versus Diamond Dallas Page. So you can play in all 3 of these matchups. Of course, if you don't remember Tiger handheld games, there's not a whole lot to them. They weren't the best graphic-wise, but man, oh man, as a kid in the 90s, they kept you entertained. They were fun to play for like 2 minutes, and then you lose interest and you move on to the next thing. But these do exist, they are out there, and they're highly collectible now too. These come out around 1998-99 era. But they were just cool looking, ultimately. Aesthetically, they were very pleasing. Maybe not so much like gameplay-wise, but still, it was cool to see nonetheless. And that's our merch of the week here on Back in the Day. Well, we've come to the conclusion of this episode, and as always, if you're not doing it, please like and subscribe here to World Championship Wreckage. Especially if you love WCW like we all do. Because there is so much content on here about World Championship Wrestling. And hey, if you like channels like this, then you should check out our channel, Cole TV, where we have all sorts of amazing content for you on a weekly basis. We have our weekly shows, Learning the Ropes and Pro Wrestling 60, as well as specials regarding professional wrestling and stuff outside of professional wrestling as well. There's a little bit of something for everybody over on Cole TV. And this week on Cole TV, you can catch a replay of our popular show, The Hunt. And on this episode, we'll be celebrating Free Comic Book Day as we go to a local comic book shop here in my hometown called M&M Comics and try to see what free comics and what goodies we can come up with. Also this week, we got a brand new episode of Learning the Ropes coming up this Sunday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we are continuing our talk on factions. And this week, we're going to get to a very familiar faction with you all here on World Championship Wreckage. We are talking the NWO. So we're going to talk about the history of NWO, the impact they had on wrestling, and so much more. And we're going to be joined by very special guests this week from World Championship Wreckage. Dad Hat himself will be joining us, well, so we may have some other surprises lined up too. So tune in 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Sunday night over on Cole TV. And you can always catch an episode of Pro Wrestling 60 every Monday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Pro Wrestling 60 is where we cover everything that happened in the world of professional wrestling that week in 60 minutes or less. And that's going to wrap it up for this week's episode of Back in the Day. And once again, please hit that like and subscribe button. Till next week, I'm XLJtheOG, and we'll see you on another episode here of Back in the Day.